1941, early summer. The requirement was simple: a machine that could move faster and hit harder than anything the USAAF currently possessed. The B-26 Marauder was a tough bird, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. The A-20 Havoc offered low-level versatility, the new design. The A-26 Invader was meant to be the attack bomber replacement par excellence. It was a synthesis of speed, payload, and lethal concentrated firepower. The aircraft was sleek, compact, and engineered around the raw, unrelenting force of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radials, thus promised a maximum speed of 373 miles per hour. Crucially, it was designed to carry only a fraction of the crew required by its predecessors. Initially just a pilot and a gunner for the solid-nosed A-26B, this was a truly revolutionary concept. It maximized efficiency while retaining heavy armament, but the promise of technological superiority was quickly swallowed by the reality of development. The Invader's birth was not swift. It was a prolonged, painful process, plagued by institutional friction. Engineers wrestled constantly with the integration of new equipment. They struggled against the unforgiving demands of tooling for mass production. Worst of all was the indecision radiating from the USAAF command. Change orders arrived like daily telegrams, forcing costly redesigns. This slowed initial production rates to a painful crawl. The military simply could not settle on the Invader's precise tactical role. It left designers constantly adjusting the aircraft's focus, exacerbating the delays. The cost of this ambition, the inherent risk of pushing the envelope of speed and power, was measured in blood long before the aircraft reached the front lines. On a clear, cold day over the test range, a prototype was pushed hard to meet the speed demands. It suddenly yawed violently, the roar of the R2800 radials, usually a comforting, powerful sound, twisted into a strangled shriek as the airframe failed to respond to the pilot's frantic inputs. Ground crews watched, helpless, as the sleek silhouette tumbled. It became a dark, heavy shape falling from the sky. The subsequent impact was a deafening, sickening punctuation mark to months of tireless work.
When the smoke finally cleared, the sight was devastating.
A mangled mass of aluminum and scorched earth. The loss of both crewmen served as a grim reminder. The Invader was not just a collection of advanced blueprints and powerful engines. It was a volatile, demanding machine, capable of fatal betrayal. This danger was not confined to the air. Even on the ground, the Invader struggled against the very elements it was designed to conquer. In the training fields of the American South, and later in the muddy staging areas of England, a persistent, frustrating flaw emerged: the landing gear. The sophisticated mechanism, designed to tuck the wheels neatly away for maximum speed, proved agonizingly vulnerable to the conditions of operational airfields. Lieutenant Colonel Ted Hankey, watching his squadron arrive at Great Dunmow, saw the problem manifest in real time. The English weather was its usual misery. Scudding clouds hung low at 1,500 feet, with 2 thick layers of overcast above that. Below, the ground was a nightmare. Hankey recalled that the runway was slippery, and the Essex mud alongside was even worse. The fields were saturated, thick, wet concrete that grabbed and held. As the aircraft landed, mud, snow, and debris were flung up, forcefully jamming themselves into the delicate nose and main landing gear mechanisms. The result was frequent, catastrophic nose gear failures. A pilot might execute a perfect approach, only for the nose wheel to refuse to lock down, or worse, to collapse upon touchdown. The screech of tortured metal and the grinding halt of propellers chewing into the tarmac became an all-too-common sound. The engineers tried fixes, but the environment was the true enemy, relentlessly clogging the mechanisms. But the ground crews tasked with maintaining the machine, the frustration was immense. They had been given a technological marvel, an aircraft that could potentially win the war single-handedly, and they spent their days wrestling with frozen windscreens and digging mud out of actuators. They watched new aircraft slide off the slick runways and crash into the mire, destined to become nothing more than rusted relics waiting for salvage. The Invader was born into a world of speed and violence, but its first great battles were fought against bureaucracy and mud. July 1949, the A-26 Invader's first real taste of combat was not the clean, high-altitude strike envisioned by its designers. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl in the suffocating humidity of the South Pacific. The 13th Bombardment Squadron in New Guinea received the initial operational aircraft. The jungle air was a thick, wet steam that clung to the metal and seeped into the men's lungs. Everything was slick with condensation, the smell of burnt engine oil mixed with the heavy, rotting vegetation of the tropics. The Invader, built for speed, was thrown immediately into low-level attacks against hardened Japanese strongpoints. Lieutenant Commander Frank "Buzz" Harris pushed his A-26 low over the dense canopy. He felt the raw, thrilling acceleration of the double wasps, but as he began his attack run, the aircraft's inherent flaws became terrifyingly clear. Harris hammered the stick, trying to track his target through the fragmented visibility of the jungle floor. The sophisticated clamshell canopy, which looked so modern on the tarmac, felt restrictive and blind in a high G turn. He had to crane his neck fighting the harness, yet the view remained obscured. He realized, with a sickening jolt, that the massive, powerful engine nacelles were positioned exactly where they created critical blind spots during aggressive maneuvering. He was flying into a curtain of small arms fire that was relying only on instinct and the sheer speed of the machine to survive, because the aircraft's own design had stolen his peripheral vision. A sudden, ripping hail of fire shuddered through the airframe, a sound like a giant tearing canvas. The Invader jumped. Harris pulled out, sweat stinging his eyes, his gunner shouting frantic corrections over the static-laced intercom that had survived. But the combat evaluation report filed back to command was unambiguous. The aircraft was potent, but its ergonomics were actively trying to kill the pilot. The Invader had the muscle, but it was flying with a case of severe tunnel vision. This difficult debut confirmed the skepticism already brewing among senior commanders. General George Kenney, overseeing the air war in the Pacific, saw the reports and felt his initial reluctance confirmed. He had a war to fight with the reliable A-20s and B-25s already in his inventory. He did not want the A-26. He did not want to complicate his supply lines or his training regimen for a machine that, despite its speed, arrived with a long list of operational defects. Standardization was survival, and the Invader was an unwelcome deviation. To overcome this institutional resistance, the focus shifted radically to the European theatre of operations. The 9th Air Force, recently transferred to the UK to support the relentless Allied advance, was designated as the primary proving ground. In August, 1946 Combat Evaluation Project Squadron was formally established. It drew 18 crews from Barksdale Field to perform a clinical assessment of the bomber's capabilities. But Europe presented its own unique brand of resistance. These were veteran medium bomber groups, masters of the B-26 Marauder. They revered the Marauder for its almost mythical ability to fly home riddled with holes.
The A-26 was supposed to be the great technological leap forward.
Yet, early evaluation missions quickly revealed a frustrating truth. General Hoyt Vandenberg, commander of the 9th Air Force, watched the data accumulate closely. The A-26 was lightning fast, slicing through the temperate skies with ease. But in the medium-altitude bombing role, the bread-and-butter mission of the 9th Air Force, it offered only marginal improvement over the B-26. The new machine was powerful, but it lacked the proven, unflinching durability of the Marauder. The crews, already exhausted by the constant operational tempo, looked at the sleek Invader and drew a devastating conclusion. It was not the successor to their beloved B-26. Perhaps it was better suited to the low-level attack and strafing missions of the A-20. The consensus was quiet, professional, and ultimately devastating. The A-26 was a marvel of engineering. But for their immediate needs, it was merely an expensive lateral move that had been given a Greyhound when they desperately needed a bulldozer. The machine was now facing its greatest challenge, proving its worth to the men who had to fly it. It had to survive the accurate, life-ending flak barrages thrown up by the German ground defences. The stage was set for a turbulent, often disastrous integration. The promise of victory had to be paid for, one mission at a time, in technical failures, strategic missteps, and the relentless pressure of combat. The Invader had arrived in the ETO, but the battle for its acceptance had just begun. The transition was less a careful introduction and more a complex forced marriage. The 9th Air Force, transferred across the Atlantic to support the Allied ground surge, needed a tactical bomber that could operate faster and closer than anything they currently flew. The 416th Bombardment Group, a seasoned unit flying the A-20 Havoc, was chosen to bear the brunt of the A-26 Invader's operational debut. Their conversion began in September 1940. It was a logistical and training labyrinth set against the backdrop of an unforgiving European winter. The schedule was brutal. Crews wrestled with the new aircraft in an intense compressed training cycle, often exacerbated by the capricious weather. The combination proved lethal to equipment. At Wethersfield in October, the persistent, frustrating weakness of the Invader's design reasserted itself. Landing gear failures. At least 3 aircraft crumpled on the tarmac on October 18th, followed by another nosewheel collapse the very next day. The ground crews, struggling in the mud that thickened like wet concrete, learned a harsh lesson. The Invader was a high-performance machine utterly intolerant of poor field conditions. Winter arrived with a vengeance at the end of October, bringing not only mud but shortened days. They averaged just 7 hours and 45 minutes of daylight for training and missions. Yet, the 416th pressed on, becoming the USAAF's most experienced A-26 unit. Their first taste of ETO combat came on September 6, 1944, with Project Squadron crews striking German strongpoints at Brest. But the true test of the Invader's tactical worth arrived in mid-December. On December 16, 1944, the German Ardennes counter-offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, slammed into the reeling Allied ground forces. It launched under a thick, choking blanket of fog that grounded the 9th Air Force completely. For 7 agonizing days, the airmen sweated out a break in the weather. Their determination to aid the infantry, fighting desperate close-quarters battles in the snow, was immense. One group, recognizing the critical need, elected to launch without fighter escort rather than abandon their objective. Then, on December 23rd, the sky broke. It was not a gradual clearing, but a sudden, crystalline revelation. The thick, grey shroud that had hung over the front lines for a week vanished, revealing a snow-swept, frozen landscape below. The airfields instantly erupted into controlled chaos. The silence of the fog was replaced by the deafening, visceral roar of dozens of R2800 double wasps being coaxed to maximum power. The A-26s, designed for speed and rapid deployment, were finally unleashed. The 416th Bombardment Group commenced sustained operations immediately. They threw their invaders into the fight against crucial targets, bridges at Saarburg, communication centers at Waxweiler. These were not milk runs. The Luftwaffe, though starving for fuel and pilots, still commanded formidable anti-aircraft defenses, and the skies were laced with lethal flak. During the mission to Saarburg, the crews witnessed the terrifying fragility of their comrades. An older A-20 Havoc, flying alongside the invaders, took a direct flak hit. Fire and smoke instantly poured from its engine nacelle, a thick black plume staining the otherwise clear sky. The pilot made a Herculean effort, fighting the controls to keep the crippled machine level long enough for the crew to bail out. The A-26 crews, flying faster and lower, were deep in the same danger. Captain Prentice, during the Hillsheim mission, described the air surrounding his Invader as being constantly punched by intense flak bursts. The shock waves rattled the canopy, and the smell of ozone filled the cockpit. The concentrated firepower that the Invader carried in its solid nose was matched only by the concentrated fire it drew from the ground. The cost was immediate and stark. The transition to the A-26, intended to reduce crew exposure, did not eliminate the peril. On Christmas Eve, over Zulpich, and again on Christmas Day over Bad Münstereifel, several invaders were lost to intense flak. This was a grim holiday toll paid in the freezing air above the bulge. The Invader survived this crucible, but its role continued to evolve. The persistent threat of cloud cover and ground haze led to the necessity of PFF, or Pathfinder Force, bombing. Crews were forced to rely on estimated time of arrival and secondary targets, blurring the lines between precision attack and area bombardment. Yet, the A-26's speed and inherent design strengths ultimately won over the skeptics. Command, recognizing its capability for rapid attack, removed prior restrictions on low-level missions. This tactical shift opened new possibilities, but also exposed the crews to even more concentrated enemy fire. The war was moving fast. The A-26, despite its teething problems, was finally proving it could keep pace. It had survived the mud, the bureaucracy, and the initial skepticism. Now it had to survive the flak. The year 1945 began not with a strategic breakthrough, but with a visceral, grinding struggle against the elements. The relentless operational tempo demanded by the final Allied push collided head-on with the cruel realities of a European winter. For the crews of the 416th Bombardment Group, based in France and newly converted to the A-26 Invader, the first days of January were a grueling green nightmare. On January 1st, a pioneering attack on Mont-Laban encountered heavy flak. But the true adversary was the obscuring smoke bombs dropped by the enemy, turning the target area into a chaotic white void. That mission cost them Lieutenant Murphy's aircraft, lost over enemy territory. The very next day, January 2nd, the fight shifted drastically from the sky to the runway. Dawn broke over the airfield, the air thick with damp mist that immediately froze onto windscreens. It was a vicious, silent killer. As the A-26s began their takeoff runs, the moisture combined with the extreme cold to induce wing and carburetto icing. The powerful invaders, loaded with ordnance, became heavy, uncontrollable beasts on the slippery tarmac. Lieutenant Roberts' aircraft was one of the first victims that morning. He fought the controls, but the Invader was mushing and spinning as the engines choked on the frozen air. The twin R2800s stuttered violently, then they failed completely. Heavy and fast, the Invader slammed into the ground and erupted in fire. The explosion was so violent, so concussive, that Roberts, who had somehow managed to scramble free and dive into the meager cover of nearby trees, was physically blown out of his hiding spot. He was sent sliding across a frozen pond amidst the searing heat and smoke. Sergeant Windisch ignored the secondary explosions. He performed a heroic, desperate rescue, pulling the pilot from the burning wreckage. The carnage continued relentlessly. Lieutenant Clark and his gunner perished instantly, their crash attributed directly to the rapid onset of wing icing. Other crews, like Lieutenant Harris and Lieutenant Montrose, barely nursed their crippled engine trouble back to the tarmac. Lieutenant Lackner, however, executed a dead-stick crash landing after his engines quit completely. He miraculously saved himself and Corporal Musara. The Invader, designed for speed and tactical superiority, was proving dangerously fragile under the pressure of the European winter. Throughout January, the weather conditions were a constant, psychological drain. Ground haze and thick fog became the norm, often grounding the 416th Group entirely. This forced them into the frustrating imprecision of Pathfinder Force bombing. Mission after mission targeted crucial infrastructure, specifically the Simon Bridge. That bridge was the vital artery for southwestbound transport from Koblenz and Mainz. Crews bombed it repeatedly from January 15th onward. They watched the approaches and surrounding areas crumble into dust. Yet the bridge itself, frustratingly, remained standing. It became their private target, a stubborn symbol of the war's refusal to end. When the skies finally did clear, the A-26 began to operate as intended. It started showing its true, lethal potential. On January 23rd, the group shifted strategy to low-level bombing and strafing runs at Blankenheim and Dasburg. This was the Invader's true domain. Flying Officer H.J. Wilson found himself alone after losing his formation in the bad weather. He chose not to abort the mission. Wilson continued on course, pushing the nose down into the thin, frozen air. The Invader became a screaming projectile. He spotted a road choked with German vehicles and soldiers' supply lines trying to snake their way to the front. Wilson did not hesitate. He held the stick steady, his finger pressing the firing button, unleashing the concentrated fury of the nose guns. Tracers arced out, stitching the ground below, that watched a large truck veer violently off the road, piling into a ditch. Thick black smoke instantly poured from the wreckage that missed his formation. But rather than turn back, he had carved his own line of destruction. On that very same day, the sheer cost of this tenacity was paid by Captain Paul Atkinson and Lieutenant Dale Ackerson. Their Invader was caught in a flak barrage so intense it felt like the aircraft had flown directly into a fist. A shell ripped into the left engine and elevator controls, instantly destroying the airspeed indicator. Atkinson was left with a crippled machine, fighting desperately to keep it airborne. In the bombardier navigator seat, Ackerson was screaming. It was not a scream of panic, but of intense, agonizing pain. Shrapnel had shredded both his legs, resulting in rapid, catastrophic blood loss, yet, As the cockpit filled with the metallic tang of blood and the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid, Atkinson refused to collapse. He continued plotting their position, his voice strained but precise, that had provided Atkinson with critical course corrections. Atkinson looked down at the growing pool of crimson beneath his bombardier. Atkinson was bleeding to death right there in the cockpit. There was no time to reach an airfield, and certainly no time for caution. Atkinson made the critical, life-or-death decision. He would crash land in friendly territory immediately. Then nursed the crippled invader over the bomb line, the single good engine straining violently. Then he brought the heavy bomber down onto the snow-covered ground. The landing was violent, a desperate, controlled slide. The impact was enough to throw the severely wounded Atkinson from his seat, dislocating his shoulder, but the maneuver had saved his life. These stories of extreme danger were not isolated incidents. Lieutenant J.C. Gary's crash landing after gear failure, or Captain R.J. Tutt's emergency landing after flak wounded his bombardier and knocked out his hydraulics, were the daily reality of the 416th. The A-26 was proving its worth, but not without immense sacrifice in blood and steel. By February, the operational intensity had only increased further. The ground echelon's necessary move from Melun to Léon disrupted all continuity. It forced crews and maintenance staff into the famed 40x8 boxcars. These were cramped, freezing metal containers originally designed for either 40 men or 8 horses. The stark discomfort of transit was merely a prelude to the immediate peril of the targets. The new shift in strategy focused relentlessly on crippling German transportation hubs. On February 14th, the 9th Bombardment Division had its most active day since the Battle of the Bulge. A daytime mission to Rheinbach produced immediate visual confirmation of success. Observers reported enormous explosions, brilliant flames and smoke reaching high into the sky. This confirmed the total destruction of a major ammunition dump. But 2 days later, on February 16th, the cost of this success was exacted in full over the Unna Ordnance Depot.
Lieutenant Bob Bauer pushed his A-26 through the final turn toward the target.
The flak was not scattered bursts. It was a solid, inescapable wall. It was, he remembered, very, very intense and accurate. Bauer's eyes scanned the sky ahead, searching desperately for a path through the storm of steel. He later recalled seeing flak everywhere he looked. The German gunners had laid down a curtain of fire so dense, so concentrated, that it seemed to him someone had taken a black crayon and colored out the blue sky. The invader shuddered violently, engulfed in the shock waves of the nearby detonations. The navigator, seeing the impossible density of the barrage, had already taken them off the precise center of the town. He knew a direct run would mean certain annihilation. Their gunner counted 250 bursts within immediate proximity. In that lethal air, the aircraft flown by Flying Officer H.J. Wilson, the same Wilson who had bravely pressed his solo attack weeks earlier, took a massive hit. His gunner was Sergeant E.F. Burks. Observers watched as the invader suddenly nosed up and then started downward, still under control, before disappearing into the thick, dark clouds at 6,000 feet. They were never seen again. The losses continued to mount. Lieutenant Chalmers' A-26 was struck by heavy flak over the mechanic truck depot and descended in flames. Lieutenant R.K. Johnson's Invader was hit in the engine on February 21st, crashing and tragically killing civilians on the ground below. Despite the speed, the advanced armament and the sheer tenacity of the crews, the war remained a brutal, unyielding contest. The A-26 Invader was winning its battle for operational acceptance. But every successful mission was etched in the memory of those who had been lost to the black crayon sky. And the final furious months of the war in Europe became a constant harrowing race against time. The A-26 invader groups were tasked with collapsing the remnants of German infrastructure. The 416th Bombardment Group, now the most seasoned invader unit, flew mission after mission. They struck marshalling yards, airfields, and communication centers. The operational tempo was relentless. The high-performance A-26 was proving its worth, but it was still a vulnerable target. The mission on March 18th was a strike against the Worms Communications Center. The 416th Bombardment Group expected a blind Pathfinder force mission, relying entirely on instruments and estimation through the thick European overcast. Lieutenant Chitty, flying the No. 2 position, braced for the routine of instrument bombing. But as the formation neared the target, the clouds abruptly dissolved. The sky opened up into a brilliant, crystalline, clear altitude vision.
unlimited.
They were instantly exposed. The German flak gunners, fighting fiercely for their collapsing homeland, were deadly accurate that day. Chitty felt the bursts erupting at his 6 o'clock, bursts close enough to rattle his teeth. Then came a sound far worse than the routine explosion of a shell. It was a single, deafening whump that instantly silenced his left engine. The Invader yawed violently under the sudden imbalance. Inside the cramped cockpit, the air filled immediately with the sharp, metallic smell of pulverized aluminum and burning oil. Sergeant Raccio, his gunner, shouted over the intercom. His voice was tight with adrenaline. "Metal fragments in my compartment, Lieutenant," he screamed. "There are holes in the tail and wings." Chitty fought the controls, desperately trying to maintain his position as the wounded propeller began to windmill uselessly. He attempted to feather the damaged prop. Before he could complete the procedure, 2 more explosions rocked the aircraft in quick succession. The force was immense. He felt a sudden, sharp sting across his face as the windshield and canopy shattered, showering him in powdered glass. He was flying a sieve. The left engine was dead, and the airframe was screaming in protest. He knew he could not stay with the formation. Maintaining the box was suicide. Chitty peeled out, the damaged Invader dropping away from the relative safety of the group, alone, nursing the sputtering right engine. He began the agonizing solitary flight back across the bomb line. The fuel pressure on the working engine was a terrifying 10 pounds, barely enough to keep the massive R2800 turning. He flew low, relying entirely on speed and sheer luck. He knew that if the remaining engine coughed once, he would become another statistic in the fields below. The war remained a relentless exchange of violence. Just days later, on March 21st, the 416th suffered a catastrophic internal loss. Captain R.J. Rooney and his flight leader collided mid-air, sending 2 A-26s spiraling down. All personnel were killed, save for Lieutenant Robert L. Kirk. The very next day, Lieutenant D.A. Farrow was hit by flak. He executed a brilliant, desperate crash landing at Venlo, even though heavy 1,000-pounders remained unfused and resting precariously in his bomb bay. Assured, this was the brutal reality of the Invader's final push in Europe. The 9th Bombardment Division dropped 24,000 tons of bombs in March 1945 alone. They turned German supply nodes into smoking craters. On March 9th, the Luftwaffe launched its biggest show against medium bombers since the Battle of the Bulge. 30 Focke-Wulf 190s were deployed against the A-26s of the 386 Bombardment Group. The air battle devolved into a chaotic, spinning dogfight of attack bombers against fighters. A-26 gunners claimed 8 kills in the melee, even as 3 invaders were downed. Yet, despite the flak and the occasional fighter threat, the A-26's speed and firepower proved decisive. In the Mediterranean theater, the 47th Bombardment Group used the Invader for night intrusion missions. Operating against German supply routes in mountainous northern Italy, the aircraft excelled in this new role. Lieutenant Charles V. Wilson, flying missions over Venice, recalled the danger. "We had some real hotspots too," he said. In the area around Venice, for example, we could always expect searchlights and lots of flak. But the A-26, often flying without a gunner to save weight and maximize range, was fast enough to evade the worst of the ground defenses. Whether equipped with the glazed nose for the bombardier or the solid nose housing 6 machine guns, the Invader was finally recognized as the potent attack bomber it was designed to be. The end in Europe came abruptly. The final missions of the 386th and 391st Bombardment Groups struck the Stod ammunition plant on May 3, 1945. Days later, the war in Europe was over. By VE Day, A-26 groups had flown 11,567 combat sorties. They had dropped over 18,000 tons of ordnance, a testament to the aircraft's rapid integration and effectiveness. But the Invader's story was far from finished, celebrated. The Pacific prepared to inherit the machine. The 319th Bombardment Group, transferred from the MTO, arrived at Machinato Field, Okinawa, in July 1945. Their conversion was marked by urgency and profound environmental hostility. The field was still under construction, and the heat was almost unbearable. Rain turned the ground into thick mud likened to wet concrete. This made the simple act of moving a 500-pound bomb feel twice as heavy. the A-26, built for sleek speed, immediately struggled against this new environment. Captain Tenney, returning from a mission, ran critically low on fuel. To conserve, he kept his landing gear retracted until the final approach to Kadena. When he tried to drop the nose wheel, however, it refused to budge. The mechanism, already proven vulnerable in Europe, was now clogged with the unique enemy of the Pacific, coral dust and stones. Tenney had no choice but to force land. He held the nose up until the last possible moment before the propellers chewed into the tarmac. The damage was repairable, but the message was clear. The environment, not the enemy, remained the invader's most persistent technical challenge. The missions continued, targeting Japanese airfields and marshalling yards. Lieutenant Gene Ryan, flying over Japan on August 9, 1945, was on a bombing run against Kanoya Airfield. As his formation turned, a blinding, brilliant flash of light erupted far to the west. Then, a massive, roiling dust cloud began to climb, impossibly fast, reaching 35,000 feet. The crews watched in stunned silence. They realized they were witnessing an atomic detonation over Nagasaki. The war the A-26 was fighting was changing into something terrifying and decisive. It was a conflict the 20th Air Force suddenly did not want them flying near. This realization led to a chaotic, premature celebration on August 10th on Okinawa. It was a night of indiscriminate firing where every weapon, from pistols to 5-inch guns, discharged into the sky. The tragic result was multiple deaths and injuries. The 319th flew their last official combat mission on August 12th. It was a maximum effort strike to neutralize remaining Japanese air assets. The A-26, though a latecomer to the war, had proven its worth. Its legacy was not limited to the war's final violent days. Despite persistent myths, the clamshell canopy or solid nose could not be easily retrofitted to earlier models. They were integral production realities, the result of specific tooling and design choices. The true genius of the Invader lay in its ability to switch between its core roles, bombing and strafing. It could do this without a major nose section swap, making it a true multi-role asset for the modern battlefield. Its speed and ruggedness ensured the A-26 survived the immediate conflict. It carried its lethal name into subsequent wars, most notably Korea. But perhaps the most poignant transformation lay in its civilian afterlife. As the military phased out the aging World War II stock, many A-26B models were acquired by civilian operators. The sleek, lethal attack bomber, once designed solely to annihilate enemy supply lines, found a new purpose. By the early 1960s, it was converted into a firebomber. The nose guns were stripped away. The bomb bay was replaced by massive internal tanks designed to dump chemical retardant onto raging wildfires. The Invader, once a harbinger of death, became a desperate tool of salvation. Its powerful R2800 radial engines now roared over American forests, not German cities. It was a stark and profound contrast to the flak-filled skies of Europe and the Pacific. The aircraft's legacy, though often eclipsed by its more famous brethren, was ultimately one of enduring utility. It stands as a testament to a robust design that simply refused to quit the fight. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.